The crisp autumn air swept through Greenwood Cemetery, scattering golden leaves along the stone paths. Julian Blackwood stepped out of his jet-black Maybach, the soft thud of the door echoing in the silence. Adjusting the cuffs of his tailored charcoal overcoat, he exuded the same effortless sophistication that made him a legend in boardrooms. Billionaire, tech visionary, cultural icon. Julian was used to controlling everything in his world. But today wasn't about power. It wasn't about deals or data. Today marked 5 years since Celeste Monroe died, the only woman who had ever made Julian believe in something beyond himself. He came here every year, same date, same hour, no entourage, no headlines, just the hollow silence and that weight in his chest that no amount of money could lift. As he moved deeper into the cemetery, polished leather soles crunching over gravel, Julian noticed something that didn't belong. A child, small and still, sitting beside Celeste's grave. The boy looked no older than 6. His thin jacket no match for the biting wind. Tousled brown hair fell over wide, pale eyes that stared into nothing. Julian's jaw tightened. No one ever came near this grave. He'd made sure of that. Security. Discretion. Why was this kid here? "Hey!" Julian called out, his voice steady but edged with curiosity. "You lost?" The boy slowly looked up. Their eyes met, and something in Julian's chest seized. There was something eerily familiar about those eyes. A shape, a depth, a memory he couldn't quite place. The boy shook his head. "No," he said softly. "I came to see my mom." Julian blinked. The words didn't land right. "I'm sorry, what?" The boy pointed to the headstone. "Celeste Monroe." Julian's breath stopped. His body didn't move, but inside, everything shifted. Celeste had never been pregnant. They talked about children, sure, but life had gotten in the way. She died before they ever had the chance. Yet here, this boy sat, claiming Celeste was his mother. A strange tension curled in Julian's gut. He crouched slowly, trying to make sense of the impossible. "What's your name, kid?" "Noah." The boy replied, eyes still fixed on the gravestone. The name meant nothing, but those features, the eyes, the shape of his mouth, they weren't just familiar. They were haunting, like echoes of Celeste that refused to fade. Julian's pulse thundered in his ears. If this was real, if this child was hers, then Celeste had kept a secret so monumental it shattered everything he thought he knew about. "Where do you live?" he asked, forcing his voice to stay even. Noah hesitated, tracing the edge of the marble with tiny fingers. "At the shelter, in Brooklyn. They take care of me there." Julian felt something twist in his chest. Celeste's child left in a shelter? While he spent the last 5 years mourning her, had this boy been out there, invisible, alone? "Who told you she was your mother?" he asked, heart pounding. "Miss Margot," Noah answered. "She works at the shelter. She said, 'My mommy left me when I was a baby. She loved me, but she couldn't keep me. She came to see me sometimes, but then she stopped. Miss Margot said she went to heaven.'" Noah's voice broke slightly on that last word. Julian's hands trembled, but he hid it. Celeste, visiting a child in secret, his child. His mind spun, colliding with memories, timelines, the impossibility of it all. Had she hidden Noah out of fear or guilt? Julian's voice came low, uncertain. "Did she stop coming? Because of me?" Noah's answer was simple and devastating. "I don't know." Julian stood, rubbing his temples. This wasn't a crisis he could throw money at. This wasn't an IPO. This was grief colliding with betrayal, and a child he didn't know how to look at without seeing the ghost of the woman he had loved. He pulled out his phone, his voice clipped. "Tobias, I need you to find out everything about a kid named Noah, shelter in Brooklyn, who he is, who his parents were, any medical records, quietly." He ended the call and turned back to the boy. "Come with me." Noah looked hesitant. "Where?" "Somewhere warm." The boy glanced at the headstone one more time, then took Julian's hand. It was a small gesture, but it shifted something tectonic in Julian's world. They walked toward the car, the city waiting silently beyond the gates. For the first time in years, Julian Blackwood, master of the boardroom, ruler of data empires, had no idea what came next. But he knew one thing: he couldn't walk away. Julian's Maybach slid quietly through the streets of Brooklyn, the tinted windows casting shadows over Noah's face as he sat in the passenger seat, small and silent. The city buzzed outside, honking taxis, street vendors shouting over traffic, but inside the car, it was still, heavy. Julian kept glancing at the boy. He didn't know what to say, how to bridge the canyon between them. He'd closed billion-dollar deals with less hesitation than he felt right now. How was he supposed to talk to a 6-year-old who might be his son? When they reached the shelter, Julian parked and stepped out, adjusting the lapel of his coat more out of habit than need. Noah trailed behind him, his small hand tucked into the oversized sleeve of his jacket. The building was plain. Red brick, weathered around the edges, wedged between two taller, colder apartment blocks. Julian had funded shelters like this before, donated at galas, posed for photos with ribbon-cutting scissors. But now, standing in front of one, it felt different. Personal inside, the air smelled like old paper and cleaning supplies. A woman behind the front desk looked up, her expression softening when she saw Noah. "Back so soon, sweetheart," she said, then noticed Julian and stiffened. "And you are?" "Julian Blackwood," he said, producing his card and placing it gently on the counter. "I need to speak with Margot Hayes." The woman blinked at the name on the card, clearly recognizing it. Without a word, she disappeared down the hallway. A moment later, Margot appeared, small, wiry, maybe in her late 60s, with piercing eyes and the kind of calm that came from decades of chaos. Her gaze went straight to Noah. "There you are," she said with a warm smile. Then she turned to Julian. "Mr. Blackwood, you know who I am." Margot folded her arms. "Celeste told me about you." Julian's jaw clenched. "But she never told me about him. She made me promise." "Never to tell you," Margot said, her voice even. "She wanted to protect you, and him." Julian felt the weight of her words press into his chest. "Protect me from what?" "The truth," Margot replied. "The pain, the mess, herself." Julian paced once, running a hand through his hair. "She loved me. We were planning a future." "She did love you," Margot said gently. "But she had a past. One that didn't fit your world. She made the hardest choice of her life when she gave up Noah. She thought it was the only way he could have a shot." Noah sat quietly nearby, his legs swinging slightly off the bench. He was listening, absorbing. Julian looked at him. For years, he'd built walls to protect himself from the chaos of emotion, but now, looking at this boy, so small, so much like her, he felt those walls cracking. "What happens to him now?" he asked Margot. "That depends on you, Mr. Blackwood," she said. "He has no legal guardian. He's been here since he was a baby. If you walk out, nothing changes. He stays here, waiting. If you want to be part of his life, that's your choice." Julian stared at Noah. The boy was looking down, shoulders hunched, like he was bracing for disappointment. It broke something in Julian. He didn't know what kind of man he was meant to be in this moment, protector, father, stranger, but he knew one thing: he couldn't leave this child behind. He knelt in front of him, voice low. "Come on, kid," he said. "Let's get out of here." Noah looked up, surprised. Hope flickered behind his eyes. Without a word, he followed Julian out the door. The ride back to Manhattan was quiet. Noah leaned against the car door, his small hands folded in his lap, eyes drifting over the lights that blurred past the windows. Julian sat beside him, staring ahead, but not really seeing the road. His mind churned with thoughts he couldn't silence. This wasn't just a complication. It wasn't something he could file under deal with later. This was a life. Celeste's life, continued in a boy who had her eyes, her quiet strength, her mystery. Julian had buried her 5 years ago, but now he felt like part of her had returned, real and breathing, sitting just inches away. The Maybach rolled into the underground garage of Julian's penthouse. The moment they stepped inside the private elevator, silence wrapped around them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. When the doors slid open, Noah stepped into the sleek, expansive space, his head tilting up to take it all in. The soaring ceilings, the glass walls, overlooking the city, the curated furniture. Everything was immaculate. Everything screamed wealth and precision, but nothing felt like it was made for a child. Julian noticed it immediately. How stark it all seemed with Noah standing there, small and unsure, surrounded by cold marble and expensive art. The space, once his sanctuary, now felt sterile. "You hungry?" Julian asked, setting his keys on the counter. Noah shrugged. "A little." Julian opened the fridge, scanning its contents. Wine, prepped gourmet meals, protein bars. Nothing remotely kid-friendly. After a pause, he grabbed bread, cheese, and butter. "How about grilled cheese?" he offered. Noah's face lit up just slightly. "Okay." Julian wasn't exactly at home in the kitchen, but he could manage a sandwich. The sizzle of butter on the pan broke the silence as he focused on something simple, something he could control. Meanwhile, Noah wandered toward the living room, pausing in front of a shelf lined with books and framed photos. One in particular caught his attention, a picture of Celeste, smiling, radiant in the golden light of some long-forgotten afternoon. "She was really pretty," Noah said softly, his fingers hovering just above the glass. Julian turned from the stove, a knife in one hand. He crossed the room and stood beside the boy, eyes fixed on the photo. "Yeah," he said, voice low. "She was." Noah looked up at him. "Did you love her?" Julian's throat tightened at the question. The answer was easy, but saying it out loud, it made everything more real. He nodded. "With everything I had." Noah's gaze dropped. "Miss Margot said she loved me too, but she couldn't keep me." There was no accusation in his voice, just sadness, and maybe a trace of confusion. Julian crouched beside him. "I don't know why she didn't tell me about you," he said honestly, "but I know she must have had her reasons, and whatever they were, I don't think it had anything to do with how much she loved you." The boy nodded, but didn't respond. His eyes drifted back to the photo, to the woman who had tied their 2 lives together without either of them knowing. After dinner, Noah curled up on the massive leather couch, wrapped in a blanket that seemed to swallow him whole. He flipped through a book Julian had pulled from a shelf, something simple, with pictures and large text. He looked smaller than ever, barely making a dent in the oversized furniture. Julian sat across from him, nursing a glass of scotch. The city lights flickered beyond the glass walls, but his thoughts weren't on stocks or mergers. He'd already texted Tobias to keep digging into Celeste's past, to find out if there were any records, birth certificates, legal papers, anything that might explain how Noah ended up alone in a Brooklyn shelter. But deep down, Julian already knew what the answer would be. There was no one else. Noah had no one, and now he was here. Noah blinked slowly, his eyes struggling to stay open. He shifted under the blanket, pulling it up to his chin. Then, quietly, "Are you going to send me back?" Julian's heart pulled tight. "Do you want to go back?" he asked. Noah shook his head. "No, I don't have anywhere else." Julian set his drink down and leaned forward. "Then you're staying." The words came out stronger than he expected. Final. Real. Noah looked at him, startled, like he hadn't let himself hope for that. Then slowly he nodded and sank deeper into the couch, his body relaxing in a way that told Julian everything he needed to know. This boy wasn't just scared. He was waiting for someone to decide he was worth keeping. Julian Blackwood had built his life on sharp instincts, flawless strategies, and hard lines. But tonight, as he watched Noah drift to sleep in his penthouse, he realized he had just crossed a line he couldn't and wouldn't walk back from. Julian awoke to soft, unfamiliar sounds, the gentle rustle of movement down the hall, the quiet hum of a living space that no longer belonged solely to him. For a moment he stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the new rhythm his life had taken on. And then it hit him. Noah. He wasn't alone anymore. Throwing back the covers, Julian ran a hand over his face and stepped into the hallway barefoot. The penthouse, usually silent this early, held a different kind of stillness now, one edged with presence rather than absence. He found Noah standing near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the blanket from the night before still draped over his shoulders. The morning light painted the boy in hues of orange and gold, casting long shadows across the floor. He looked out at the city like it was another planet. When he heard footsteps, Noah turned, his expression cautious. "I didn't know if I should wake you," he said quietly. "You're fine," Julian replied, his voice gravelly from sleep. He glanced at the clock. 6:30 a.m., too early for someone who typically operated in the hours of late-night boardroom calls and 2 a.m. problem-solving sessions. But today, he didn't mind. He moved into the kitchen and opened the fridge. "You hungry?" Noah hesitated, before nodding. "Yeah." Julian scanned the shelves, mentally cursing the wine bottles and imported condiments that mocked his lack of preparation. He finally pulled out a carton of eggs and some bread. He wasn't a chef, but he could scramble. Probably, as he cracked eggs into a pan, he asked over his shoulder, "You ever been to school?" Noah slid onto a stool at the counter, clutching his blanket like a shield. "Not really. Miss Margot tried to homeschool me, but she had too many kids." Julian nodded. He wasn't surprised. He'd read the reports Tobias had sent the night before. Overcrowded shelter, underfunded, kids slipping through cracks the system no longer had time to patch. Noah deserved more than that. As the egg sizzled, Julian snuck a glance at the boy. He was watching him closely, not with fear, but with hesitation, like he was still trying to figure out whether Julian was real or just another temporary stop in a long line of disappointments. They ate quietly. Noah barely touched his toast, but he didn't push the plate away either. Julian didn't push, didn't ask questions. He knew what it felt like to want space, even in silence. After breakfast, Julian stepped into his home office, the city skyline stretching out behind his desk. He called Tobias immediately. "Dig deeper," he said, skipping pleasantries. "I want everything. Birth certificate, medical records, shelter transfers, anything that tells me where this kid's been and who failed him." Tobias's voice came calm as always. "You got it." Julian hung up and leaned back, exhaling. He didn't know what the next move was. Adoption, guardianship. But whatever path this took, he needed to be prepared. By mid-morning, he made another decision. Noah needed clothes. The jacket he wore was clearly borrowed, sleeves too long, zipper half broken, and his sneakers had seen better days. Julian wasn't about to parade him through a luxury boutique, though. He needed someone who could handle this. Someone who knew how to make people feel seen. So he called Naomi Clark, his assistant, brilliant, unshakable, brutally efficient. Had worked for him for years. She was one of the few people who could match his pace and never miss a beat. When she picked up, he didn't waste time. "I need your help with something. It's personal." An hour later, Julian's car pulled up outside a Fifth Avenue storefront, and Naomi was already waiting at the curb. Impeccably dressed, tablet in hand, she raised an eyebrow as Julian stepped out, Noah trailing behind him, clutching the sleeve of his new hoodie. "You didn't mention you had a kid," she said flatly. "I don't," Julian replied. "Not Officially, Naomi gave him a long look, then turned to Noah and crouched slightly. "Hey there, I'm Naomi. What's your name?" The boy hesitated before answering. "Noah," she smiled warmly. "Nice to meet you, Noah. Let's get you looking sharp, yeah?" The next hour passed in a blur of changing rooms and careful questions. Naomi handled everything: sizes, styles, brands. She kept it simple and fun, letting Noah pick what he liked, guiding him gently without overwhelming him. Julian watched quietly, marveling at how easily she connected with him. It was a gift, one he didn't have, but what surprised him most was Noah. Slowly he began to relax. He smiled once, even laughed when Naomi handed him a ridiculous hat. It was a flicker, but it was real. Later, as they drove back to the penthouse, shopping bags in the trunk, Noah clutched a new book Naomi had insisted on buying him. His fingers traced the cover like it was made of gold. Julian glanced at him, then looked back at the road. He'd planned for everything in his life: investments, security, reputation. But he hadn't planned for this. For a boy who now felt like his responsibility, for a future that no longer belonged just to him. That night, after a quiet dinner in the penthouse, Noah sat curled into the corner of the couch, his new hoodie draped over him like armor, a book open on his lap. He wasn't really reading. His eyes moved over the pages, but his mind was somewhere else. Julian sat across from him in an armchair, nursing a glass of whiskey, watching the city blink to life outside the windows. Manhattan glittered beneath them, restless and relentless. It usually calmed him. Tonight, it didn't. Out of nowhere, Noah's voice broke the silence. "Do you ever get scared?" Julian blinked. He looked at the boy, surprised not by the question, but by the honesty behind it. "Sometimes," he said after a beat. "I'm not proud of it, but yeah." Noah nodded slowly, like that answer made more sense than anything else Julian had said all day. "Me too." The words hit harder than Julian expected. This kid had every reason to be scared, abandoned, alone, now living with a man he barely knew in a home that felt like another planet. And yet, he was still here, still trying. As the evening wore on, Noah's head dipped lower, eyes fluttering closed. Eventually he drifted off, the book slipping from his hands. Julian rose quietly, grabbed a blanket, and covered him. He stood there for a moment, staring down at this child, this stranger who had walked into his life and shaken it to the core. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this: Noah wasn't going anywhere. The next morning came with a new sense of urgency. Julian paced his office as Tobias's voice came through the speakerphone. "Got everything you asked. It's complicated." "Of course it is," Julian muttered. "Go on." "There's no father listed on Noah's birth certificate. Celeste is confirmed as the mother, but the records are fragmented. After her death, he was passed. Between foster homes, neglect reports, system failures, nothing stable. He ended up at Margot's because no one else had room." Julian's hands curled into fists. "So he was just lost in the system." "Pretty much." "And no family?" Julian asked. "None that claimed him. No legal guardians, no wills. Nothing." Julian stared out the window, jaw tight. For all her grace and brilliance, Celeste had left behind a trail of silence. No preparation, no letter, just a boy who had nowhere to go. Later that day, Julian came home earlier than usual. Noah was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by books. He looked up, surprised to see Julian so soon. "How was your day?" Julian asked, loosening his tie. "Good," Noah said softly. Julian nodded, sitting on the edge of the couch. "What are you reading?" Noah held up a collection of classic stories. "Some of them are kind of sad." Julian leaned back, thinking. "Sad stories can be important. They teach us things we wouldn't learn otherwise." Noah looked thoughtful. "Did you read sad stories when you were a kid?" The question caught Julian off guard. He hadn't. His childhood was filled with cold ambition, business books and market reports shoved at him by a father who believed vulnerability was weakness. Not really, he admitted. Noah didn't press. He just nodded and returned to his reading, but the quiet between them had shifted. Not uncomfortable, just heavier, more honest. After a while, Julian cleared his throat. I found some information about your past. Noah tensed. Your mum didn't list your father. Not anywhere. There's no trace of him. Noah's fingers tightened around the book. She never talked about him. Julian hesitated. Do you ever think about looking for him? The boy shook his head without hesitation. If he wanted me, he would have found me, right? Julian didn't answer right away. That simple statement, said so quietly, so matter-of-fact, cut straight through him. Noah wasn't just surviving. He had learned how to expect nothing, hope for nothing. Later that night, after Noah was in bed, Julian stood by the window staring at the skyline. His reflection in the glass looked tired, older. He'd built his life on answers, plans, control. But none of that mattered now. His phone buzzed. Tobias again. I found something else, his voice said flatly. Old record, sealed, buried in a defunct database. Celeste filed a request for paternity testing when Noah was an infant. Julian's pulse spiked. And? She never followed through, but she listed a name. Julian's hand tightened. Around the phone. Whose? Tobias hesitated. Victor Langston. Silence. Julian's heart dropped. Victor Langston, the ruthless investor, boardroom predator, billionaire who tore companies apart for sport. A man Julian had crossed paths with more than once. They were rivals in every sense, and now, maybe something more. You're sure? Julian asked, though he already knew Tobias wouldn't call unless he was. Positive. It's real. Julian ended the call and sat down slowly, the weight of it all crashing down. If Victor was the father, that changed everything, because Victor didn't lose, and he didn't let go. Julian didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, the name Victor Langston circling his mind, like a storm refusing to break. Victor wasn't the type of man to ignore unfinished business, especially not something as personal as a child. If he found out about Noah, he would come for him, not out of love, but out of principle, control, possession. Victor didn't believe in connection. He believed in leverage. And Noah was the kind of leverage that could change everything. By morning, Julian had made a decision. He needed to confirm the truth. But more than that, he needed a plan. If Victor was really Noah's father, he couldn't risk the boy being pulled into another world of cold, strategic power plays. At breakfast, Noah sat at the table, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate. The light in his eyes had dulled since the night before. Julian could feel the boy slipping back into old habits, retreat, protect, survive. How do you feel about going to the park today? Julian asked, trying to lift the air. Noah looked up, eyebrows raised. The park? Julian nodded. Central Park. Might be good to get some air. The boy gave a small shrug. Okay, I guess. It wasn't enthusiasm, but it was something. They arrived mid-morning, the air crisp but not punishing. Autumn leaves spun through the wind like fading memories, and the park hummed with quiet life. Joggers, dog walkers, kids squealing by the pond. Noah walked beside Julian in silence, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, eyes flicking from one corner of the world to the next, like he was still learning how to exist in it. They found a bench near the water. Ducks glided along the surface. A breeze picked up, brushing past them gently. Julian turned to him. You said your mom never talked about your father. Noah's shoulders stiffened. Yeah. What if she tried to find him? Julian asked carefully. What if she wasn't sure who he was and tried to confirm it? The boy frowned. I don't know. She never said anything. She just worked a lot. She was always tired. She didn't talk about stuff like that. He looked away, voice lower. I think she was scared of something. Julian felt a slow dread creep into his chest. If Celeste had been scared, she had reason to be. What if you had a chance to find out for sure? He asked. Would you want to? Noah shrugged, but it was forced. I don't think it matters. He's not here, right? Julian hesitated. What if he found out about you now? Noah's head snapped toward him, eyes wide and voice sharper than usual. I don't want him to. Julian was quiet. I don't care if he's some rich guy or whatever, the boy said, his words tumbling out fast, full of heat and pain. He wasn't there. He didn't care. Why should I care now? The silence that followed was heavy. Julian leaned in, voice steady. You don't owe him anything. But if he ever does find out, I won't let him take you. You stay with me, if that's what you want. Noah's face was unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders eased just a little. That evening, Julian met with Tobias in his office. We need a paternity test, Julian said, no hesitation. Quiet, discreet. No labs that tie back to Victor. Tobias nodded, already pulling up names. If Langston gets wind of this, he'll come for the kid. I know. You're not planning to tell him. Not unless I have to. Tobias glanced up. So you've already made your decision. Julian leaned back, eyes heavy. That boy has already lost everything. I'm not handing him over to a man who sees people as assets. Tobias smirked faintly. Bold words for a billionaire with a god complex. Julian shot him a look. Don't mistake me for Victor. I don't, Tobias said, but he will. 2 days later, the envelope arrived. Julian sat at his desk, staring at it for several long minutes before breaking the seal. The test was thorough, clean, conclusive. Victor Langston was Noah's biological father. Julian's heart sank, though he had expected it. Seeing it confirmed on paper made it feel heavier, like a fuse had been lit under a life he was just starting to rebuild. He closed the folder and stared out at the skyline. Victor Langston wouldn't stay in the dark forever, and when he came, and he would, it wouldn't be to form a bond. It would be to assert dominance, to remind the world who was in control. Julian knew this game. He'd played it his whole life. But this time, the stakes weren't money or power. They were flesh and blood, and he wasn't about to lose. Julian knew the peace wouldn't last. Every day he held on to the paternity results, every hour that passed without Victor Langston knowing. It was time borrowed, not time earned. And Julian Blackwood understood better than anyone that borrowed time always comes with interest. Noah had started to settle, not completely, not the way a child should, but the jagged edges had softened. He no longer flinched at every sudden noise. He didn't avoid eye contact as much. There were moments, fleeting but real, where he acted like a kid. They went to a bookstore in Midtown one afternoon. Julian had expected resistance or boredom. Instead, Noah's face lit up the second they walked in. He trailed his fingers along the shelves, like they held magic. By the time they left, he was hugging a stack of books like they were treasure. Later, walking along the Hudson, Noah asked Julian about his childhood. That moment stuck with him more than anything. Noah wasn't just surviving anymore, he was starting to hope, and that terrified Julian more than Victor ever could. That evening, Julian came home to find Noah sitting at the dining table, a book open in front of him. But he wasn't reading. He was staring at the page, like it held a question he couldn't ask. Something on your mind? Julian asked as he set down his briefcase. Noah nodded slowly. I was thinking about my mom. Julian sat across from him, silent. She was tired a lot, Noah said, eyes still on the book. Back then, I didn't get it. I just thought she was always busy, but now I think she was sad. Even when she smiled, I could feel it. Julian felt a pang in his chest. Celeste had always carried herself with grace, but now, through Noah's words, he saw the cracks she must have hidden. "She did everything she could for you," Julian said softly. "She loved you. That much is clear." Noah nodded, then paused. "Do you think she knew who my dad was?" Julian hesitated. "I think she had an idea. But maybe she didn't know if he'd be the kind of father you deserved." Noah looked up sharply. "So, he's a bad guy?" Julian exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "Not exactly, but he's powerful, and sometimes powerful people make really bad decisions, especially when it comes to family." The boy studied him for a moment. "Do you know who he is?" Julian's stomach tightened. This was the moment he had hoped to avoid a little longer. But lying now would only fracture the fragile trust they'd built. He nodded slowly. "I do." Noah's voice dropped to a whisper. "And you didn't tell me?" Julian leaned forward. "I wanted to be sure. I needed proof before I told you something that heavy." Noah's hands clenched into fists. "Who is he?" Julian met his eyes. "His name is Victor Langston." At first, the name meant nothing, but then Noah blinked. "The guy on TV all the time? The business guy?" Julian nodded once. Noah pushed back from the table, his chair screeching against the floor. "So, he's rich too?" "Yes. And he never looked for me." "He doesn't know about you," Julian said gently. "Your mom never told him, and I only found out recently." Noah was pacing now. "So what happens next? Are you going to tell him?" "Not unless you want me to." The boy froze. "What if he finds out anyway? What if he tries to take me?" His voice cracked on the last word. The fear behind the question was raw. Julian stood and crossed the room, placing a steady hand on Noah's shoulder. "No one is taking you," he said firmly. "I won't let that happen." Noah searched his face for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. That night, Julian lay awake in bed again. The truth was out. There was no undoing it. Noah had a father, a powerful one, and when Victor Langston found out, the real battle would begin. Julian didn't know exactly when it would happen, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity: he would be ready. Julian had known it was only a matter of time. The truth had a way of finding daylight, no matter how tightly you tried to bury it. And Victor Langston wasn't a man who stayed in the dark for long. Still, when Naomi burst into his office one afternoon, face pale, urgency cutting through her usual composure, Julian felt his chest tighten before she even spoke. "He's here," she said. "In the lobby." Julian didn't have to ask who. Victor Langston. The name hit like a thunderclap, not because it was a surprise, but because of what it meant. Time was up. Julian straightened his cuffs, adjusted his watch, and walked out of his office with the calm of a man stepping into a war he already expected. He found Victor in the lobby, exactly as he remembered him, commanding, calculated, and dressed in a way that said, "I own everything I walk into." His icy blue eyes locked on Julian's the second he appeared. "Julian," Victor said smoothly, "we need to talk." Julian nodded toward a private conference room. "This way." The moment the door shut, Victor dropped the polite facade. "You've been keeping something from me." Julian kept his voice neutral. "That depends on what you think I'm hiding." Victor's jaw clenched. "Don't play games with me, I know." Julian said nothing. "A child," Victor said. "My child. Don't insult me by pretending you don't know what I'm talking about." Julian's silence was answer enough. Victor exhaled slowly, pacing once across the room. "I want to meet him." "No." Victor stopped mid-stride, turning. "Excuse me." Julian stepped closer, his tone sharp but measured. "He's not an asset you can acquire. He's not a company to take over. He's a boy, a scared, intelligent, extraordinary boy who doesn't even know if he wants anything to do with you." Victor's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to make that decision." "I'm not," Julian said. "He is." The two men stared each other down, the room crackling with quiet intensity. Then Victor's tone shifted. "Fine, I'm not here to force anything. I want to send him a message, that's all. A letter." Julian studied him. It was unlike Victor to offer anything without strings. But this wasn't a negotiation Julian could win with numbers or leverage. This was about Noah. "I'll give it to him," Julian said finally. "But if he doesn't want contact, you back off, for good." Victor's lips twitched into something resembling a smile. "We'll see." That evening, Julian sat across from Noah at the dining table, a sealed envelope between them. "It's from Victor," Julian said. "I haven't read it. I told him the choice is yours." Noah stared at the envelope like it might explode. He didn't reach for it right away. "What does he want?" "To meet you, but only if you're ready." Silence hung between them, thick and fragile. Finally, Noah picked up the envelope. He opened it slowly, unfolding the letter inside. Julian watched his face closely. Confusion first, then something softer, then guarded again. After a long pause, Noah looked up. "He said he didn't know about me, that if he had, things would have been different?" Julian didn't respond. He let the boy process at his own pace. "He wants to meet," Noah said. "And do you want to?" The boy looked down at the letter again. His fingers tightened around it. "I think I need to." Julian's chest tightened. He nodded once. "Okay, I'll arrange it." It wasn't a commitment. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a beginning. That night, Julian stood by the window long after Noah had gone to bed. The city sparkled below him, indifferent to the lives unfolding inside its towers. He had protected Noah as long as he could. But the next step belonged to the boy, and all Julian could do now was stand beside him. The following evening, Julian's car moved steadily through Manhattan traffic, the city glowing under dusk's amber haze. In the back seat, Noah sat stiffly, his hands clenched together, a bundle of nerves wrapped in a too-big hoodie. His gaze stayed fixed on the skyline, but his thoughts were somewhere far deeper and far messier. Julian sat beside him, watching in the reflection of the window. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said. The choice had been Noah's, and Julian had honored it. But it didn't make this easier. They pulled up in front of an upscale restaurant tucked into the corner of a quiet midtown block. No paparazzi, no press, just neutral territory. "You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with," Julian said as the driver opened the door. "You say the word, and we leave." Noah nodded, but his voice was barely above a whisper. "I know, but I have to do this." Julian placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, firm, steady, then let him go. Inside, the maitre d' escorted Noah through a hushed dining room toward a private section in the back. There, seated at a corner table near a window, was Victor Langston. He stood the moment he saw the boy. Victor looked exactly as Noah had seen him on television, tall, immaculately dressed, every inch composed and powerful. But tonight, there was something different in his eyes. Nervousness. Noah didn't expect that. "Thank you for coming," Victor said as the boy approached. Noah slid into the seat across from him. "I almost didn't," Victor nodded. "I wouldn't blame you." There was a pause, a strange silence filled with all the things neither of them knew how to say. "I didn't know," Victor finally said. "If I had, everything would have been different." Noah didn't answer. He just stared at him, studying his face like he was trying to spot a lie buried beneath the expensive suit and polished charm. "Why didn't she tell you?" he asked. Victor exhaled. "I wasn't someone she could trust back then. She was right. I was young, obsessed with my career, ruthless, and she knew I'd try to take control of everything, including you." Noah blinked. "So she was protecting me?" "I believe so," Victor said. "And I don't blame her. I would have ruined it. I know that now." The boy looked down at the table. So what do you want now? Victor paused before answering. I want to know you. Nothing more. The waiter came and went, but the food was forgotten. The conversation turned slowly. Small things, like what Noah liked to read, what he remembered about his mom. Victor listened, not interrupting, not pushing, just being there. For once. At the end of the meal, Victor pulled an envelope from his coat. I wrote this the night I found out about you. It's not much, just everything I didn't know how to say out loud. Noah took the envelope and slipped it into his pocket without looking at it. Thanks. Victor stood as the boy got up from the table. I don't expect anything from you, he said quietly. Not now. Maybe not ever. But if you ever want to talk, I'll be here. Noah gave a small nod and walked out without looking back. Julian was waiting by the car. As Noah slid into the back seat, Julian studied his face, searching for regret. Anger, disappointment. How did it go? He asked gently. Noah stared straight ahead for a long moment, then finally said, Better than I expected. Julian nodded and didn't press further. As the car merged back into traffic, Noah pulled the envelope from his pocket, turned it over in his hands, but didn't open it. He didn't need to. Not yet. For now, it was enough to know it existed, that someone who should have been a ghost was, for the first time, real. And for the first time in his life, Noah felt like maybe he wasn't completely alone. The days that followed felt surreal. Noah had gone to sleep the night after meeting Victor without saying much. He hadn't mentioned the envelope again, and Julian didn't push. Some truths needed to sit quietly in the background until the heart was ready to confront them. Julian watched him more closely now, not out of suspicion, but out of something he couldn't name. Noah was changing, slowly, subtly, less guarded, a little more curious. He asked more questions. He challenged Julian on little things, like why he didn't know how to cook pasta or why he kept 3 of the same black sweaters in his closet. For Julian, it was disarming. For Noah, it was healing. They spent a Saturday morning walking through a street market in Soho. Julian bought fresh pastries he didn't know the names of, while Noah pointed at things that fascinated him. Old books, broken cameras, a jazz trio playing on a corner like they'd never stop for time. Julian caught himself smiling more than once. Not the PR smile he wore at galas, a real one, something softer, something he hadn't worn in years. Later that evening, they sat on the floor of the living room, sorting through a box of old vinyls Julian had collected but never played. Noah pulled out a David Bowie record and held it like a fossil. Did you actually listen to this stuff? Julian chuckled. Careful, you're showing your age. You're the one with the ancient music. Julian laughed, a deep, rare sound that made Noah grin despite himself, but just as quickly as joy arrived, it faded, replaced by silence as Noah's eyes drifted to the window. The city lights flickered against the glass. Do you think he meant it? Noah asked suddenly. Julian didn't have to ask who he was. Yes, he said after a pause. I think he did. Noah nodded. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything right now, Julian said. Just keep breathing. Noah let out a shaky breath, almost a laugh. That's harder than it sounds. Julian leaned back against the couch, sipping his drink. I know. Later that night, after Noah was asleep, Julian stepped into his office. The city below felt distant, almost like a painting. He poured a glass of whiskey and sat at his desk, staring at the closed envelope Tobias had delivered earlier that day. An update on Victor. Julian had requested a full risk analysis. He didn't know why. Maybe part of him still didn't trust Victor. Maybe another part was waiting for the man to show his hand. He flipped the folder open. The first few pages were expected. Assets, recent acquisitions, press clippings. But the last page made Julian freeze. Victor had filed for preliminary custody rights, quietly, discreetly, but it was already in motion. Julian slammed the folder shut, jaw tightening. So that was it. Whatever the dinner meant, whatever words were exchanged, Victor Langston hadn't changed. He was still playing chess, just slower, quieter, and now the game was official. Julian stared at the folder, heart pounding, a low burn building in his chest. He had made Noah a promise. He would not break it. Victor wanted a fight. He was about to get one. Julian stood at the window of his penthouse, the city stretching endlessly beneath him, restless and unbothered. His reflection in the glass looked back at him. Sharp suit, tired eyes, clenched jaw. Victor Langston had made his move, and now it was Julian's turn. He had faced mergers worth billions, walked into rooms filled with men who would slit each others' throats for market share. He'd outmaneuvered rivals, dismantled corporations, redefined industries. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was war over a boy, over Noah. The next morning, Julian sat Noah down at the breakfast table. He didn't sugarcoat it. Victor filed a custody petition. Noah froze, fork halfway to his mouth. Julian continued, his voice calm but resolute. Nothing's happening yet, but it means he wants to be legally recognized as your father. With rights. The boy's expression didn't change, not at first, but Julian could see it in his eyes, the fear, the confusion, the anger. "Do I have to go with him?" Noah asked, barely above a whisper. Julian shook his head. "Not unless. A judge says you do, and I'm not letting it get that far." Noah looked at him, really looked at him. "But he's rich, he's famous. What if they choose him?" Julian leaned forward. "Then they'll be choosing wrong, because they don't know you. I do." Noah swallowed hard. "Why's he doing this?" "Because that's who he is," Julian said. "He sees something he thinks belongs to him, and he moves in to take it." Noah pushed his plate away, appetite gone. "I don't want to be something people fight over," he muttered. "You're not," Julian said gently. "You're someone worth fighting for." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Noah looked up, and in his expression was something Julian hadn't seen before: resolve. "What do we do now?" Julian exhaled. "We prepare." Over the next several days, everything shifted into motion. Tobias brought in a team of legal experts, private, trusted, ruthless when needed. Naomi cleared Julian's schedule, rerouting meetings and pushing back deals. Every hour became strategy, every moment calculated. Julian had never fought for custody. He'd never even considered fatherhood. But now he was preparing to go to court, not just to keep a child, but to prove that he was the only one who should. At night, when the noise of legal chaos faded and the penthouse grew quiet, Julian would find Noah sitting by the windows, legs tucked up, blanket around his shoulders. "You okay?" he'd ask. Noah never said yes, but he always nodded. One night, Julian walked in to find Noah holding the envelope Victor had given him at the restaurant. It was still sealed. "You haven't read it," Julian said. Noah shrugged. "I thought I wanted to, but now I don't know." Julian sat beside him, the city glowing beneath them. "You don't have to. Not now. Maybe not ever." Noah looked at him. "What if? What if I'm his kid, but I don't want to be?" Julian met his eyes. "Then that's your truth, and no one can take that from you." The boy was quiet for a long time. Then, "Can I stay with you, even if they try to take me?" Julian didn't hesitate. "You're already with me." Noah nodded slowly. The envelope rested on the coffee table between them, unopened. As the legal battle loomed ahead, as the media started whispering about an impending clash between two billionaires, one old school, one reformed, Julian didn't flinch. Because at the heart of it all wasn't a power play, it was a promise to protect a boy who had never asked for any of this. A boy who had simply wanted to be wanted, and now, finally, he was. Not because of a DNA test, not because of a court order, but because Julian Blackwood had chosen him, and would keep choosing him, no matter what came next. If this story moved you in any way, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapters.